Okay, part two. Protective clothing. I'm on page 1312. Okay, we'll start off adding this to your notes. Just know that when selecting chemical protective clothing, you need to know the specific chemical that you're dealing with. So make sure you add that. And also know the chemical's compatibility. You can put that, know the specific chemical and the chemical's compatibility. All right, here we go. Protective clothing overview. Protective clothing must be worn whenever an emergency responder faces potential hazards. You have thermal hazards, the type of exposure, chemical, biological, radiological. Skin contact with hazardous material can cause problems such as chemical burns, allergic reactions, rashes, diseases, absorption of toxic materials into the body. Protective clothing is designed to prevent these problems from happening. So make sure you have on the proper PPE. Body armor or bomb suits can be worn to protect against ballistic hazards, such as explosions. But do know this, no single combination or ensemble of protective equipment can protect from all hazards. Remember that. Fumes and chemical vapors can penetrate firefighting turnout clothes and pants. Chemical protective clothing offers no protection from fires. Appropriate PPE protects the skin, eyes, face, hearing, hands, feet, body, head. Technological advances are being made to improve versatility in all types of PPE. You must understand your PPE's limitations to stay safe. Know that. Always use the correct PPE, requires special training and instructions. Use PPE in accordance to your SOPs and your manufacturer's recommendations under the guidance of a hazardous material technician or supervision of an allied professional. All right, standards for protective clothing and equipment at hazmat incidents. We need to know that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has adopted NIOSH and NFPA standards for protective clothing. We need to know that. These standards primarily apply to clothing worn at chemical biological incidents. You should be familiar with any standards pertaining to design, certification, and testing requirements of any type of protective clothing. That includes body armor, structural firefighting gear, bomb suits. Depending on the location, responders may need to be familiar with their standards regarding respiratory equipment issued by the ISO. Structural firefighter protective clothing. Know this, it is not a substitute for chemical protective clothing. However, know this, it does provide some protection against many hazardous materials. So if that's all you have, you're the first one on scene, it's a rescue operation, structural firefighting gear with an SCBA, and basically get somebody, get them out, and make sure that you get decontaminated. Now, if you're on scene already, you know it's a hazmat incident, and you're gearing up, then you can take your time to pick and make sure you choose the correct protective clothing. Atmospheres in burning buildings are filled with toxic gases, and modern structural firefighters protective gear with SCBAs that will provide adequate protection. There's multiple layers, coats of the pants may provide a short-term exposure protection from materials such as a liquid chemical. So it might provide some protection. But do know this, limitations. Neither corrosive resistant nor vapor tight. Know that liquids can soak through your structural firefighting gear. Acids and bases can dissolve or deteriorate the outer layers. Gases and vapors can penetrate the garment. So gaps in the structural firefighter clothing could be around your neck, your wrist, your waist. So some hazardous materials can permeate, which means pass through. This is important to know this term, permeate, pass through, molecular level. Know that. and remain in the structural firefighting clothing. Chemicals absorbed into equipment can cause repeated exposure and later reaction with other chemicals. Hang on just a second. Had a fan on, somebody turned it on. Okay. Chemicals can permeate, know this, chemicals can permeate rubber, leather, neoprene, and make pieces of your uniform unsafe. May be necessary to discard equipment exposed to permeating chemicals. Know that. There's much debate among experts as to the degree of protection provided by structural firefighting protective clothing. Agencies, emergency response plans, and SOPs should specify conditions, circumstances under which it is appropriate for emergency responders to rely on firefighter structural protective clothing and SCBAs during operations at a hazmat incident. Now, structural firefighting protective clothing, explosives will provide protection against thermal damage. Know that it's limited or no protection against projectiles, shrapnel, or other mechanical effects from a blast. So your structural gear is not for explosives. Maybe just the thermal part, but not the shrapnel and the projectiles. Radiological materials will provide adequate protection against some types, but not others. Alpha, beta, yes. Gamma, neutron, no. Biological agents. Biological agents, structural firefighter protective clothing with SCBA may provide adequate protection if they are strictly respiratory. If skin contact is potentially hazardous, it will not be sufficient. Materials must be properly identified in order to make that determination. Anytime a terrorist attack is suspected, it should be assumed that responders wearing only structural firefighting protective clothing with SCBA are at some level of increased risk from explosives, radiological materials, chemical or biological weapons. High temperature protective clothing. We need to know that it's designed to protect the wearer, know this, from short-term exposures to high temperatures in situations where heat levels exceed the capabilities of a standard firefighting PPE. Now, in the past, I may have told you guys, standard firefighting PPE, we're looking at about 500, 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So a high temperature protective clothing is going to give you that increased protection for temperatures above that. Your face piece is only designed basically for around 300-400 degrees. Usually of limited use in dealing with chemical hazards. So high temperature gear doesn't really come into play in a lot of the chemical hazards. Now, there's a couple of different types of high temperature protective clothing, and you need to know both of these types. You need to know what a proximity suit is. You need to know that a proximity suit that's going to permit close approach to fires, whether you need to do a rescue, fire suppression, those sort of things. Provides greater heat protection than your structural gear, so that it's close approach to a fire. Now, the second one you need to know is fire entry suits. These are going to allow you to work in total flame environments for short periods of time. And they're looking at temperatures up to 2,000 degrees. So definitely something's going to be different than structural gear. So fire entry suits, total flame, and then of course your proximity suits, close approach. Limitations. It's definitely going to contribute to heat stress. It's bulky, limited vision, communications, requires extensive training, expensive. The integrity of the suit is designed for limited exposure time. Now, let's get into the chemical protective clothing. We need to know that its purpose is to shield or isolate individuals from hazards that may be encountered during hazardous materials operations. That can be chemical, physical, biological. May be made from a variety of different materials, and again, none which protects against all type of chemicals. Each material provides protection against certain chemicals or products, but only limited or no protection against others. The manufacturer of a particular suit must provide a list of chemicals for which the suit is effective. Selection depends on a specific chemical and specific task to be performed. Remember that. Okay, something here we need to know. Chemical protective clothing, it's actually 1316, and it's that little warning on page 1316. You need to know that chemical protective clothing is not intended for firefighting activities. Not intended for firefighting activities. It's designed to afford the wearer a known degree of protection from a known type, concentration, and length of exposure to a hazardous material. It must be fitted properly and worn correctly. Improperly worn equipment can expose and endanger the wearer. Most protective clothing is designed to be impermeable to moisture. It limits transfer of heat from the body through natural evaporation, so that can contribute to heat disorders in hot environments. So wearing a chemical protective suit in the middle of the summer can definitely cause heat stress. Regardless of the type of chemical protective clothing worn at an incident, it must be decontaminated. Responders who may be called upon to wear chemical protective clothing must be familiar with their local procedures for technical decontamination. Its designed and tested standards generally recognize two types of chemical protective clothing. Know that the ones we're going to be dealing with is a liquid splash protective and a vapor protective. Two different types, liquid splash and vapor. All right, we're going to add one thing to the design and testing. We already said two different types here. Now it didn't go over this in the particular lesson plan, but in your book, it kind of goes over a few things here. The selection of the following describe the two types and explain the operations where chemical protection is required, written management programs, ways in which the chemical protective clothing can be damaged, and considerations for the service life of the chemical protective clothing. Now I want you to add one thing to that on page 316. Chemical protective clothing is best if it has low permeation rate and a long breakthrough rate. Low permeation rate and a long breakthrough rate. Remember that. Chemical splash protective clothing. Designed to protect users from chemical liquid splashes, but know this, but not against vapors and gases. Know that. This is what we would consider a level B suit. NFPA 1992 sets the minimum design criteria for one type of liquid splash protective clothing. Now we have a level B, which is called an encapsulating suit. An encapsulating suit is a single one-piece garment. Protects against splashes. Vapor protection will also protect against vapors and gases if it is vapor protective. Boots, gloves, and sometimes separate are attached. Two primary limitations, of course, your worker's mobility, vision, communications, traps body heats. And then we've got encapsulating and non-encapsulating. Non-encapsulating consists of one-piece coveralls, sometimes composed of individual pieces. Limitations for non-encapsulating. Protects against splashes, but not against gases and vapors. It does not provide full body coverage. It also traps body heat and contributes to heat stress. So, the fully encapsulated suit covers the entire body. Your SCBA is actually covered with it also. Non-encapsulating, your SCBA might be on your back, exposed, and it's basically like coveralls with a hood. So there are some parts of your skin that could be exposed. So just know that it does not, the non-encapsulating does not provide full body coverage. Encapsulating and non-encapsulating liquid splash protective clothing is not resistant to heat and does not protect against projectiles or shrapnel. Okay, so the key to that, splash protective. More than likely, this is going to be a level B. Level B suits come in two different types. Fully encapsulated, and when we go over vapor protective suits, they are similar to that particular design, but not 100%. There's a little difference in them, but they are similar to that. So they have fully encapsulated level B splash protective suits and non-encapsulating splash protective suits. Again, if it is a level B, that's going to be with an SCBA on. If you have an airline or a SAR, that would be same thing. That would be considered level B. If you have an APR on, then that is considered a level C. We're going to get further into this, but just to let you know, if you have a splash suit with an SCBA, that is a level B. If you have a splash type suit with the canisters and APR, that is considered a level C. Now, vapor protective clothing, that's the highest we can get. That's level A. So A, vapor protective clothing. B is going to be splash protective. C can be a splash protective type with canisters, with an APR, without an SCBA. All right, vapor protective clothing protects against chemical vapors and gases. Know this, offers the greatest level of protection than splash protective clothing. If it's an unknown, then you're going to go with your highest level, which would be a level A suit, which is vapor protective. Level A, vapor protective. NFPA 1991 specifies requirements for the minimum level for protection for response personnel facing exposure to specified chemicals. It sets performance requirements for vapor-tight, totally encapsulated chemical protective suits. Includes rigid chemical resistance and flame-resistant tests. Requires permeation tests against 21 challenged chemicals. Vapor protective ensembles must be worn with an SCBA. Components of the ensembles must be used at chemical biological incidents. Primary use, and that's part of the level A protective ensemble. Provide against the greatest degree of protection against respiratory, eye, skin damage from hazardous vapors, gases, and particulates. Now, limitations again. They will melt and burn when exposed to fire. So don't be using them in a flammable atmosphere if possible. Does not protect the user against all chemical hazards. And it definitely, again, impairs mobility, vision, and communication. I think every piece of equipment we put on, when it comes from the structural gear to splash suits, level A's, it doesn't matter. Mobility, vision, communication. Again, it also does not allow body heat to escape, so that can contribute to heat stress. So you might want to wear a cooling vest. Mission-specific operations requiring the use of chemical clothing. Chemical protective clothing must be worn in certain circumstances. Without regard to the level of training required to perform them, these are operations that may require the use of chemical protective clothing. Site survey, emergency monitoring, rescue, decontamination, spill mitigation, and evacuation. If responders are involved in any of the above activities, consideration must be given to which type of protective equipment is necessary given the known and or unknown hazards present at the scene. Always follow your SOPs. All emergency response organizations that routinely use chemical protective clothing must establish written chemical protective clothing programs and respiratory protection management programs. Okay, so we need to know that. And that's under written management programs. And here's something you also need to know is that this includes policy statements, procedures, guidelines. These copies must be made available to all personnel who use chemical protective clothing. So remember, you need to know all emergency response organizations that use chemical protective clothing must establish written chemical clothing programs and management programs. Two basic objectives for any management program: protecting the user from safety and health hazards, preventing injury from incorrect use or malfunction. The program elements: hazard identification, medical monitoring, environmental surveillance, selection, care, testing, and maintenance training. Now, real quick, let's say you make it to a hazmat incident and you are operations technician level, it doesn't matter. And you've set up your control zones, you're suiting up, you've identified what you're dealing with, you're going to be suiting up to the proper PPE that you need. Before you even put that gear on, one of the first things you're going to do, and remember this, you're going to have a medical surveillance. They're going to do a baseline, which means your blood pressure and your pulse. So they're going to make sure, and they're going to ask you questions. Are you sick or feeling ill or anything of that nature? If your blood pressure's too high, heart rate's too high, anything like that, they may not allow you to make entry. So a baseline medical surveillance is the first thing you're going to do. You'll also do that medical surveillance when you come out of the hot zone and you get decontaminated. You go back and then they check your blood pressure, pulse, and all that stuff again. So remember, medical surveillance is required for hazmat operations. So you get your medical surveillance. The next thing they're going to do is you're going to go over the game plan, the incident action plan. You're going to know a little bit more about the chemical you're dealing with. You're going to get the right tools that you need. You're going to have a RIT team as a backup. So 2 in, 2 out. You must have that. Those are things that's going to happen at a hazmat incident. So let's talk about some terms that you must know. Permeation, degradation, and penetration. 3 terms you must know. And these are actions that can reduce the chemical protective clothing effectiveness. Know that. Must be considered when choosing and using protective ensembles. First term, know this term, permeation. You must know this. It's when it occurs when a chemical passes through the fabric on a molecular level. Understand that, know that. No visible evidence, understand, know that. No visible evidence of chemicals permeating material in most cases. The rate of permeation depends on factors such as chemical properties, the nature of the protective barrier, and the concentration of the chemical. Most chemical protective clothing manufacturers provide charts on that breakthrough time. I gave you that. We talked about a breakthrough time, and that's going to be the time that's elapsed. Write this down. Breakthrough time. Breakthrough time is the elapsed time between initial contact, elapsed time between initial contact of a chemical with the surface of the PPE. So again, breakthrough time, elapsed time between the initial contact of a chemical with the surface of the PPE and detection at the inside surface of the material. So breakthrough time, elapsed time between the initial contact of a chemical with the surface of the PPE and the detection at the inside surface of the material. That is the breakthrough time. Chemical degradation. Know this occurs when the characteristics of a material are altered through contact with the chemical substance. What you might see, cracking, know this, cracking, brittleness, other changes in structural characteristics of the garment. Cracking, brittleness, and other changes in the structural characteristics of the garment. We're going to add this. Know this also. Most common observations: discoloration, possible discoloration, swelling, loss of physical strength, and deterioration. Okay, you need to know all of that. Penetration. Penetration occurs when a hazardous material enters an opening or a puncture in a protective material. So penetration could be a rip, a tear, a cut, your zipper, any of those things. Often such openings are the result of faulty manufacture or problems with the design of the suit. So we need to know the difference in those terms. So penetration is movement through closures, movement through closures. That's why when you're out on a hazmat incident, you never get on your knees whenever you're trying to plug, patch, or anything of that nature, because we try to prevent penetration, a tear in the suit. So you always bend down, stay off your knees, so that we can kind of prevent any sort of hose being torn in. Service life. Each piece of chemical protective clothing, you need to know, has a specific service life over which the clothing is able to adequately protect the wearer. Potentially contaminated chemical protective clothing requires proper decontamination when the wearer leaves potential hazardous areas. Always follow your authority having jurisdiction SOPs and manufacturer specification. You need to know that. Always follow your SOPs, manufacturer's recommendations. That might help you in regards to serviceability, use, and reuse. So make sure you know that. Also know this little warning: never use chemical protective clothing that is beyond its expiration date and or has exceeded its service life. It's kind of like drinking spoiled milk. Look at the date, right? All right, PPE ensembles, classifications and selections. I'll tell you what, I am going on 30 minutes into this video. I'm going to, again, I'm going to break this one up a little bit more. So I'm going to pause right here, and then we'll come back with round 3.